Hey, fellow Geneteers, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So, as you can see, we are back again with the genuine pleasure of being joined by Dr. Bahara Sahebi. Um, and we're going to continue our conversation of religious trauma, especially focused in on the question of why do people stay in situations that are traumatizing like this, and then look at like some of the impacts that kind of follow people out and the kind of things that she sees in her practice too. So we'll kind of specifically focus on those two things, kind of building up what we were talking about last time. Thanks so much for coming on again, Dr. Sabi.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me again. I appreciate it.
And we were already talking off camera of like, okay, here's our plan for the next one and the next one. So
We have a
friend of the
lot of
show going
fun
forward.
things planned ahead. Yes, definitely.
Okay, so just as the intro for Dr. Sahebi, her clinical specialty is in couples and family systems and treatment of trauma, as well as systemic clinical supervision. Her recent scholarship is focused on collective trauma and how chronic repression, authoritarian political systems, and large-scale geopolitical forces shape psychological life within families and communities. So there's our religious trauma kind of thing we were talking about. And she has served as assistant program director and clinical assistant professor of psychology at Northwestern University and teaching faculty at Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science. She's the author of what sounds like a textbook, right? Integrative Systemic Therapy and Practice. So congratulations on that, right? And though her
Now
work is,
available in Italian. I have to
yeah,
keep pointing that out. I
you
can't
did.
read it, but I'm going to trust that Rutledge did a great job, the publisher.
Yeah, yeah, I saw that in what we're looking at. Now available in Italiano.
I have the
Uh,
book. I just can't read it.
Though to list some of where her recent work has also appeared, it's been in Fair Observer, Rest of the World, Independent UK Voices, Global Voices, and Family Therapy magazine, as well as at her Substack. And Substacks are kind of funny for me to read, so I guess you say substack.com at Dr. Sahebi. So, all the places she can find, they can find you where you're spreading all this like great work. Okay, so our questions. Oh, I gotta say the other thing that everyone always has to say, which is we want to like keep sharing the work of like great people like Dr. Sahebi. So if you can kind of share this episode, maybe give a like, maybe give a review, do all the things that people always ask you to do, that would be greatly appreciated. Again, it's a labor of love, and we just feel like we're trying to share important things in kind of an important time. So, all right, our questions du jour. I guess the first one was, why do people stay? Which I guess, a lot of people wonder about. What is it that traps people in these things? So I'll throw it up to you, Dr. Sahebi.
Yeah, last time we talked about a whole lot of areas of harm that are it's so easy to see how harmful they can be. So you're right. Sometimes we may wonder, especially when I work with some people from Jehovah's Witness backgrounds or certain sects of Islam that they come from. When I check in with them, the essence of what I get from them is because these systems don't just provide rules, they provide identity, they provide belonging and a sense of moral certainty. One of the things I think I mentioned this last time that I ask my students all the time is, do you know the one thing we all have in common? One thing that every single one of us on this planet have in common. What do you think that is?
I think we were like wondering about this when we were doing our last episode too. I guess it's a sense of belonging or
That's
something,
it.
right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a sense
I
of
was
being,
gonna I was
yeah.
gonna say poop, but
Yeah.
Yes.
Everybody does that too. Yeah, there's a
yeah,
Yes
whole book.
and
There's a
yes.
whole book about it.
that's right.
Daniel may be
Absolutely.
slightly influenced by the presence of his dog too in this particular.
Also,
So
right.
his mind is very busy.
Yeah, it's the dog in the room. So yeah, we were talking about that. Yeah,
So
pre-episode.
because of this, they provide a sense of identity, belonging, sense of moral certainty. It's really hard to leave. Leaving means you're losing your family, your community, even a sense of who you really are. And staying is often not about whether they agree with it all, but it's really about survival at some point. And psychologically, it's usually easier to kind of reinterpret that harm than to confront all the possibilities of the way that the system itself is unsafe. So many times people have that internal struggle with themselves of what is life outside of the system going to look like for me? I apologize. I just dropped something and you heard it live right on here. So that is a really, really difficult thing to grasp for people. And we can talk a little bit more about the impact on the individual, the self, their thoughts, their emotions, in a little bit too.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Daniel. You got
No, I
something?
was gonna say this is like the sort of toxic side of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I can hear, many people who I know who are in, we could say, relatively toxic religious communities. They might not view it as that way, but they would say it gives the sense of community. It gives people a sense of connection. It brings people who might not necessarily come together for this common thing of prayer and doing good for each other. But I think to your point, that's part of the coping mechanism that goes on internally when those things are trying to essentially separate you from aspects of yourself, like intentionally keeping the mirror fractured, if we're going to use a Kabbalistic reference, and so the more that you get fractured on the inside, the more that you have to then do this internal bargaining, if you will, for why it is that it's okay for you to be internally fractured, as opposed to finding something else that makes more sense, that actually vibes with you more internally. You'll stay in this thing that is probably not healthy for you if you're going to weigh it out on a scale, but you'll do it because you don't want to be ostracized or ousted from the people who are also probably likely having the same thing, the same internal feelings.
You're absolutely right. You just made me think about all the families that I have worked with who are actually, they grew up Catholic. Some of them, they have had really traumatizing experiences as children within the Catholic Church that they grew up in. And now that they're adults, they married somebody outside of the Catholic denomination, and now that they've had children, they want their children to go through communion. They want them to go through all of it. And their partner doesn't seem to understand. Look at what's happened to you. Why do you want our child to go? And this is when they sit in the session, it's very difficult for them to sit with how it creates a kind of internal fragmentation. Well, if they don't learn all that stuff, then what am I ever going to teach them, right? So religious trauma, the impact on the individual is in many different forms. It's the experience of self, for example, the experience of self where the person is questioning their own moral compass and negative self-evaluation of themselves. Well, maybe it was my fault. Maybe my parents weren't there enough when I was going, and I'll be there for my kid. Maybe I'll sign up as the eh, Bible study teacher, so that I have an eye on them. So there's a lot of that self-evaluation, family evaluation, rather than looking at the system, kind of blaming the victim in many ways.
Yeah.
I get the feeling, like, building on Daniel's metaphor, it kind of creates like a fractured self-concept or something, if you want
Yes,
to use a
yes,
phrase for that, right? It splinters it or something, right?
absolutely.
And then, like, I think that's really fascinating in your work, because you kind of talk about the splintering that can happen in like multiple ways, right? There's like the public face that you show the world versus maybe like the more private things, and you feel the tension between them, but you're not sure what to do about that angle, as an example, right?
Yes, and that impeding trust in your own and others and the world. How can I trust anything outside of what I know? There's confusion about where one's personality ends and indoctrination actually begins. Where is that line? How would I even know that? This happens in authoritarian systems as well, where right now, as I mentioned in the last podcast, I'm Iranian, and seeing some people um, just fall into the indoctrination of the trauma that has been inflicted on them for almost half a century through the religious means, but because there is an outside, there's something from outside challenging it, there's a tendency to fall back on, well, who am I without this? And retreating back into that system. Confusion about, for example, striving for psychological imperialism. I'm better than that if I am part of this. I remember when we first came to the US, my mom, who is no longer a believer of any of this, she was very nervous about, even though we came here because there was so much religious trauma and all of that. But she had the thought that if we went to Catholic, not Catholic, but Bible study on Sundays, um, Moody Church actually in Chicago for 2 years.
Moody.
Don't laugh at me.
It's a very conservative church. If you
It
don't
was
know what it
rough.
is, that's
It
why
was
we were
rough.
like,
They're
wow, that's
very
conservative.
I didn't speak English, so it was fine. I was there for the snacks. But her thought process was, hey, religious people are, they're safer, they're better, there's some sort of striving for psychological imperialism, like if they're around other families who also follow something, it's better than nothing. So I mean, she no longer thinks like that, but that's why for 2 years we went to church until my dad kept falling asleep during sermons and they eventually got kicked out, and here we are.
My
But
grandpa was usually like hungover and semi-passed out when I was in church, so I know the experience.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So that whole spiritual identity crisis that comes up for people, as there's a whole wanting to grasp onto it in order to know who they are. That rejection of culture of origin for them could equal rejection of the whole self.
Mm.
And if that culture of origin is very much tied to a religious practice or a religious mindset, then it's like, then what is my culture without this? I hear this from a lot of people that I work with who say their culture is also Islam, like they're Muslim by culture. Um, so they're from different countries in the world, but they associate themselves with a culture that is Muslim. And I always challenge that by asking, what is the culture of Islam look like? And they don't really know how to answer it. They've never thought about it that way because it's easier to hide behind that and then say I'm American or I'm Indian or I'm, wherever, somewhere from Africa or something, to be able to differentiate themselves from other people who live in that country by hiding behind a religious part, making that part of the culture. So that becomes the experience of self. And also challenges with the task of self-differentiation, which may lead to a cultural cutoff, actually. So in my case, and people like myself in the diaspora, because there has been so much challenges for so long with religious trauma inflicted by the Islamic Republic, who's in Iran, not because of Islam, but their use of Islam. Many people inside the country and outside now identify themselves as atheists.
Mhm.
They refuse to even think about any religion, and they feel entitled to be able to say, I hate, fill in the blank, whatever their religious background may be. And there's no discussion to be had. So that piece is really important because if there are challenges with the task of self-differentiation, then it's going to be all in or all out. We don't have this, I'll understand and respect where you're coming from. It's just, it's all bad. And this religious trauma shifts and shapes the experiences of your own inner world through this lens of shame, fear, uncertainty. This is particularly true for those who live within this paradoxical realities. When I was growing up, what we had to do in Iran, like outside of the house, the way we had to dress, the way we had to carry ourselves, what we had to say was very different than the life we lived inside. So it was a constant make sure they know that we don't listen to music, make sure that you don't say we had a party. And, this paradox creates a whole lot of identity crisis shifts for people.
Yeah, I know a lot of people from like Eastern Europe who were like, grew up under the Soviet system. So you talked about like authoritarian or totalitarian type systems of different types, right?
Yep.
And they had that same thing. It was very clear, like what we do at home stays at home, what we say at home stays
Right.
at home, and we show a different face out to the world, right? So we don't put a target on ourselves some way or another, right?
Now, imagine what that does to a developing psyche where you're trying to learn how to be human, but what is okay to be human, what is the right way to be a good person, who is right, who's wrong, that split, that fragmentation of the self that I'm talking about, makes people even grow up into adulthood not truly always knowing where that indoctrination continues to carry with them and how much of it is themselves and who they are and what they're supposed to do in this world, and just kind of shifting from that indoctrination from the religion and the culture that kept that to now doing what everybody else says is the right thing to do, whether it's choosing a career path or having a certain home, or even everything is following a certain order. And that's the part that people aren't really aware of, that it is wrong to be different. It is not okay to be different. And that really does come from that sense of being raised within a religious, uh, the trauma within a religious culture.
Which is why religious ethnostates, regardless of the religion, are bad.
Yes.
Full stop.
Yes.
Because this is baked in not only in the micro communities of the religious structures that are present in the culture, but they are part of the culture as a whole, and then they're baked, and then it's baked in the government.
Yes.
And so they operate then from a top down. And it just seems to me that like, and you guys can certainly think for yourself, I cannot think of a religious based ethno state that has not gone more conservative over time. And I do mean, religious and politically, both conservative, both. They're getting tighter and tighter. They want less and less freedoms as time goes on. I can't think of any one off the top of my head that is like really giving a lot of, like some of the Islamic countries, maybe women are allowed to drive sometimes, like, okay, cool. It's 2026. Great, but they're not buying their own homes or like having, I mean, Eric and I joke about this regularly on this show. But it was in the 70s in this country when women could have their own checking account, in this country,
Sign a
able to,
lease, have a credit card.
yeah, I mean,
That's like
able
my
to
mom's
vote.
generation
Decade I
of
was
people.
born. Yes,
Yeah,
in the
that's like
decade I was born.
my
Yeah.
mom's.
19, Eric, women's suffrage, 1919, is that, or something
It's
like this?
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the
So,
first, yeah. Hmm.
so it's not been that long.
No.
This idea has not been around of, women having equal rights has not been that long. So I just, we get to talk all that. And then of course we got to dunk on as many things as we can while we're doing it. So I
The
figured I
only
would
thing
keep
I
that.
got to say about this, which is like just because of the name of our podcast and it's a complicated question, but I read a lot of the Dalai Lama, right? So there's a kind of a religiously, spiritually based culture in some ways. And he
Mm-hmm.
does seem like he's trying to get it where you don't have like sectarianism. Like I was on retreat over the weekend doing my meditations and doing my stuff, and I read like the Dalai Lama at times or other like, and you could see in some of his essays, he's trying to say like, well, we can't be sectarian. If we are sectarian, we're going to cause problems, right?
Yes.
'Cause they have
Yes.
different religious, they have different groups in Tibet, right? There's four really big ones, and then there's other ones too, right? And then, so they have their own divisions, and you could see he's trying to get it to where like, let's get out of our sectarianism because it always goes someplace bad. Yeah, totally, right?
Eric, actually, this worked out really well in the 90s and the 80s, even in the 2000s. We're now at a point in the zeitgeist where this middle line no longer works. So trying to, play that fairness and stay in the center, people aren't buying it anymore. They want authenticity. People are tired of the way that religion has been used to indoctrinate them. rather than the essence of why religion was brought on anyway to, build some laws of the land thousands of years ago. Those things have
To
shifted.
do this.
And
But I mean, that's challenging, right?
it
And
is.
there's going to be people within, and we haven't talked about this too much, but there's going to be people within that subgroup. They're going to be like, well, then you're not really one of us, right? If you're not going to full on with everything, then you're not really one of us, right? But you could see that tension within the group,
Muslims
right?
have the same issue. Those who continue, still believe in Islam and want to follow that, sometimes they are caught in this cross, if they're not Iranian, because Iranians, it doesn't matter if they're Muslim or not, they know after half a century of what the Islamic Republic is about. But the non-Iranians, they feel like they are going against their religion if they speak bad about the Islamic Republic, where Islamic Republic has nothing to do with their religion. The same thing is true for Israel. So these are the ways that they trap you in you not being the systems of power, for you not to challenge them from that macro level that we're talking about right now to the smaller level, like within the family unit or within like a school unit and everything else. And that's why religious trauma really doesn't get to be talked about, because, I mean, what's there to talk about? This is either, if it's happening to you, then there's God's will, right? Or there is a definite stop at the end of a conversation with God's will, whatever's supposed to be will be, and you need to let it go. And we can see that very clearly from all the Catholic Church victims, they're survivors, and how they've been treated over the years.
Yeah, there's this like incredible. I was just thinking as you were talking, I had a student who just graduated from her family originally from Iran. Congratulations, Shadi.
Oh,
And I would ask her periodically, like, how you doing? I would check in with her about these things and, how's your family? Everybody okay? And, we had our kind of like, we were saying like, congrats, see you up the road. You've been through this with students too, sure. I'm sure, right? And she said, she really appreciated like, my being open to, like talking with her about this. She said it made her feel heard. And I was like, okay, great. That was the intention. But it was also interesting watching her in the sense that like, her feelings are ambivalent, right? Because she doesn't like the government of Iran, right? And yet at the same time, you get this like torn thing. It's a very like
yes.
painful human position to be in, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
this is why I'm here to tell you all, Iranians are not okay right now. I need everyone to take this away. We're not okay. We show up, we're good at putting on a facade and just, but our families aren't okay. We're not okay. There is like a double bind we're stuck in. It is it they're getting killed with the bombs and without the bombs as well.
Mhm.
So and a lot of it religion is being used more than ever to shift that thought. And it's really hard for us to have these conversations. So, going back to how does it impact identity, what you just brought back with Shadi's example made me think about the impact on unresolved thoughts, like the cognitive patterns, and also affective, all like the way that we process our emotions, all the thoughts and emotional constraints that we've been holding on to. And we don't even know that they're there until we're confronted with this kind of trauma. Let me give you some examples. Challenges with self-regulation. How am I going to be able to tolerate some of this distress? The experience of guilt about lifestyle choices.
Mhm.
I didn't choose, I was brought here, but people who have migrated. I chose to migrate, they think to themselves, when I should be the one over there suffering too, but I'm suffering more because I'm watching it.
Almost kind of like a survivor's guilt or something like
Yes,
that.
yes,
Yeah.
that's what I was going to say next. Exactly, survival's guilt. That may contribute to patterns of self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm going to get in my own way of my own happiness because I don't deserve this. Why is it I've asked that of myself all the time. Like, why is it okay for me to be okay and not them? And I was a child. I was 8 years old when I was brought out of the country. Shame about one's cultural identity and inferiority within the dominant culture is actually part of it too. So those of us from these marginalized communities, specifically, those who are the culture and religion have kind of, enmeshed in one, the way that they were raised. We were talking about Jehovah's before, I'll give myself as an example. There is a sense that everybody already has a mindset on who you are. Now you need to show up and show up even better and at a higher level, because every single person who you're coming across is going to say, well, I knew an Iranian once. I knew somebody from Jehovah's Witness once. And so you're carrying this inferiority, whether you want to admit it or not, where you need to continue to represent an entire population, and you need to be able to show that population differently in every single interaction that you have without actually pointing it out.
Yeah, you had said something really fascinating, and one of the things I was like doing my study on, kind of getting familiar with your work before we did our interview even last week. And you had talked about like kind of this perfectionism thing that you can find in people from, these kinds of like backgrounds for these kinds of traumatic experiences. And like what I hear in that is there's kind of like multiple levels to that. On the one hand, probably that religious upbringing demanded a kind of perfectionism anyways, right? You had
Yes.
to do things a very particular way. It had to be done. And if it wasn't, then, you could feel all the shame and guilt that I wasn't perfect.
Otherwise, God will punish you.
Yeah,
Oh,
God
for
will be mad
sure.
at me. Yeah. And then on the flip side, now you're in a situation where I still have to be perfect. I already have that tendency in me, right? But now I have to be perfect because I have to show myself as the perfect example of whatever this background is, right? Or I have to
Yeah.
give myself as the perfect example of whatever this is. And I think that's, a really fascinating observation,
So
that there's
you
like
will,
these multiple parts of this kind of together. You make that
right.
point, which is really interesting.
So what you just gave as an example, that behavioral symptom, the perfectionism, the hypervigilance, a compulsive need to perform, exists in a particular manner that oscillates between avoiding punishment or provoking reenactment in a way, I want to say. That once the indoctrination stops, continues on. That behavior continues on
I was
in
really curious
different ways.
what you like. Could you go a little bit more into the reenactment part of this? Because I heard you use that word before, and I was like, okay, I want to like
Do it
explore
again.
that a little bit more.
Reenactment. Let me see you do that again. You did this right.
Oh.
Let's keep, can you do the same way again? Good. But we can't
So this
continue
idea
to
that you keep
perform.
repeating the same things to get the same approval or something, and you
Yes,
find
yes.
yourself on this like you're like the mouse on the thing, and you keep going in that
So
same
it's an
behavior.
oscillation, right? Oscillation between avoiding punishment and provoking reenactment in a way. And sometimes provoking reenactment can also, unconsciously or subconsciously can go into kind of I deserve, I am bad, I know what I've done, so let me do something that will punish me, like God will punish me some way. So it can work both ways. But regardless, the whole point of this perfectionism and hypervigilance is being this oscillation between the two and not even realizing that's where it's coming from. The first moment somebody tells me about their perfectionism tendencies, I ask about their experience with religion growing up, what it was like. Many, many times you see this with Catholic upbringings because there is a shame aspect of it. Going to what do they call it? The
Confessional.
Yes,
Confessional.
there. You go to the confessional too. So people who say, I didn't even do anything this week, but I had to go make up some stuff to say because I still had to say it. So I hear all of that. So you're constantly sitting with that. I need to confess to something that you did or didn't do because there's a need to work toward a perfectionist point of view.
Yeah, talking about that kind of personal, not how you feel about this, Daniel, but there's the old like you can take the boy out of Catholicism, but can you take the Catholicism out of the boy
Right,
kind
right.
of thing, or the girl or whoever it is. But and I remember, like I'm better on it now, but I can certainly have this feeling of like moving away from that. And we got this spirituality podcast. We also like to talk kind of personal, so I can definitely had this feeling of like, oh, that's lingering Catholic stuff. That's lingering Catholic stuff. And then doing things like Zen or Taoist things or, Buddhist Tantra things, like it's not the same vibe and the same wavelength. And it doesn't have that same attitude towards, those perfectionistic things. And there was a tension I felt for sure, like exactly like what you're talking about. And if
Well,
you
Eric,
felt
in
like you
the
didn't do something right, you'd feel so bad. You'd feel so bad. Mm.
Eric, we did our retreat a couple weeks ago, and there's a purification. Well, there's multiple purification practices, but there's one purification practice in particular that we went over, and I was talking with one of our retreat participants about it because it does have remorse and the kind of removal of guilt and the sense of like trying to work on forgiveness, you know as part of the practice. And somebody was asking me, they're like, well, I don't feel like I did anything bad. And I've heard people talk about this before because I have mentioned this when I first learned that particular practice. And I don't know who was talking about this, but the famous person, they were like, well, you probably killed some bugs on your windshield on your way over here, and you're walking on the ground, so you probably stepped on some ants, and in your life, you definitely killed some spiders in the house that you probably didn't mean to, and there's maybe some unintended consequences from things that you've done,
Welcome to
even
VoiceOver.
trying to help
VoiceOver
other
speaks
people.
descriptions of items.
I don't know what happened. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know.
I
Anyways,
can't hear you. You're on
yeah.
mute.
Oh, well, that's not getting edited out either. Everything stays. Everything
I
stays.
don't know what happened.
So anyway,
This is a
but yeah, so
naturalistic
it's
podcast.
yeah, but it's one of these. It's something where like you have to, I think, accept that there are imperfections that you're unaware of, and that's just part of existing. But I think that the distinction that Bahar is trying to make is that there's a difference in accepting that you're going to make mistakes and pushing that to the forefront of something that you have to wrestle with as part of who you are. The sort of what do they call it? Original sin, and that you're living within. I use this analogy regularly in the clinic. Remember that game? What's that game called? Emergency or I forgot what it's called. Where you pull the bones out of the body. And
Operation.
Operation. There you go. Yeah, that's it. Okay.
You hit the
Yeah, so the
button.
game
Yeah.
Operation, for those who don't know, it's like an outline of a human body, and there's a bunch of bones inside, and you with these little tweezers, you try to pull the bones out. But if you touch either of the sides, you get a little electrical feedback. And I feel like with particular religions, and it's more than just Catholicism for sure, that has guilt as a part of it. It's definitely like playing that game Operation that you have to operate in such a very tight, narrow line. And if you stray too much, like you said earlier before, Bahara, when being different is wrong. And if you stray from those lines at all, you get the very clear sense of like that is wrong, get back in line. And so there's a very thin line of being accepting of our own flaws and our own mistakes and our own misgivings, even with the best intentions, right? The road to hell is paved in good intentions. And then also knowing that like we fuck up sometimes.
Yeah.
And I don't, it's a very thin line between religious dogma that you're fucking up constantly and a spiritual practice of trying to improve.
Yeah, the thing that gets me in like what Dr. Sahebi is sharing is imperfections or pronunciation is just the idea like can you set your own moral compass? I think that was the big thing. That's the phrase that makes it different for me for sharing stuff that might be helpful for people who might be listening. I mean, that was the big transition. Can I set my own moral compass or not? Or am I burdened by a moral compass that was sort of internalized from someplace else? And like you said, that it's hard to do that when you come from these very, traumatizing religions, we could say, or these very high control religions, right? You can't set your own moral thing. And I think that's just, you have to be able to do that as a human being, right? And that was the big difference for me as far as my, being able to share on that.
Bahar, would you say that that's part of it? Would you say that that's inherently, I mean, and the language is slightly different, but would you say that like the removal of your ability to set your own moral compass as a requisite for, or as a consequence of religious trauma is found in many traditions that you've experienced?
Absolutely. And it goes along with, I was going to say what you always talk about and you teach me about, can you unlearn what you already know? Can you this is part of your conditioning. What you're saying is part of that. Can you see that? Because that's where the constraint is. Now, what you just said isn't just about religion, right? Because the person may feel like, okay, yeah, I have nothing to do with the religion anymore. But let me give you an example. Last week, I was talking to a family that I work with, and I just had a blanket I pulled up, and she was like, oh my God, this is so pretty. There's so many colors in it. And she was so mesmerized by the colors that we started talking about her, um, her it- relationship with color. And she started talking about, yeah, I always notice in your house things are colorful, everything. And she started talking about that. And I said, I noticed that everything is very beige in what you wear and what, your couches, your everything is beige, just white walls, beige everything. And she said, yes, because this is what everybody's houses look like. And I said, actually, no, I've noticed that it to be true more for like people who are Iranian, I don't see other people having beige everything. I see colorful walls, colorful pillows, and everything. And she didn't realize until we talked that for her, it was part of it's not okay for me to individuate and all of a sudden bring in some color into my house. Even though I love color, even my baby stuff has to be beige. So we started to talk about obviously color does something to you emotionally, spiritually. It pulled at you. And other people that see my blanket, they don't have a reaction, but you just forgot what you were talking about. It lifted your spirit in a way. What would you say if, I don't know, you pick up something of color and put it in your background, like two pillows, something that can be changed? And she was very hesitant. I felt like almost like if somebody, she could, and then if somebody came, she would have to hide it. So this is part of that religious indoctrination that people don't realize it's part of them because now they're carrying it into other areas that they belong. That even though they love something, they can't be that something because it's not appropriate to be that. Other people will not accept it.
So part of that's, I guess, like I can't express my own individual identity, right? On some level, like that's been toxified. But the other part that jumps out at me, and we haven't really maybe hit on this exactly yet, but like sensuality in a way, right? The
Yeah,
colors, the senses, and then I guess sexuality is part of this too, for a podcast like
definitely.
ours. But that whole idea is like, is that kind of like forbidden things, or is it okay to enjoy the senses? Is it okay to kind of experience the senses and then even beyond that, the sensuous, the erotic, and those
I
kinds of things?
actually wanted to talk about that part specifically for women and them having the sensations about their own sexuality, their own sensuality, owning it, feeling good about it, even being able to show up for it, even within a monogamous relationship or marital couple. It's always associated with um, rigid thinking about I can't really enjoy it in that way. I have to act like it's not for me. And I'm just doing this for, especially for women, for the person that I'm with. It's not for me because there's so much shame around that to a point where it's now in the unconscious. Like they don't even realize that they're stopping themselves from feeling their own sensuality this way. It's just, I'm not a sexual person. I'm not into sex. I'm not into sensuality. And I wonder how much of that is true because it's normal to want to feel all of you, right? It's just part of who you are. And so this self-guarded um, guarding of those primary emotions with sensuality is part of that, is also one of the constraints that comes up. Now, behaviorally, we were talking about perfectionism. There are other ones too, like interpersonal challenges. So they're emotional cutoffs, meaning if other people are drinking, I don't feel like I want to be around them. You can choose not to drink, but other people are drinking. I'm not a religious person anymore, but I'm just not comfortable being around people who in their same house are having a drink or two, right? So they don't involve themselves, proximal and emotional cutoff, with expanding their circles of people because they cannot be accepting of what people do or talk about. And this intimacy and sexual dysfunction is a huge one of those things that comes up over and over again with couples. And if one member at least has had a series of has grown up in religious trauma, this area of complex trauma.
Yeah, this is kind of the phrase that you use of like sort of like a purity culture kind of
Yes, yes.
right? The purity culture is so damaging, right? And as
Yeah,
far as like a podcast like ours, though, when you cut yourself off from sensuality, when you cut yourself off, you're cutting yourself off from a whole life force, actually.
yeah.
From
Mhm.
like a tantra point of view, you've cut yourself off from a
It's
whole
part of you. It's
school.
part of like your spiritual growth in a way. It's part of you. So then another thing that you notice is that there's some sort of generalized anger. You don't really know what you're angry about. You don't know what is brewing underneath. But generalized anger challenged with the task of self-differentiation, often then leading to like cultural cutoff, like I cannot be part of this culture, or I'll feel shame about that, right? Or em, demeaning of culture of origin, because if I don't say all of, Islam is bad or something, or all Catholicism or whatever the religion, if I don't say that's all bad and that's all crap, then I'm kind of owning that it's okay to have parts of this into my life and I'm not okay with it. So this generalized anger not only is for them, but it's also about other people and their choices of life and how they want to live.
Okay,
Yeah, when I saw that, oh, sorry,
one
go ahead.
second. I wanna for a 3-minute sidebar debate, but totally related. So we're talking about religious influence on society and the changes that occur individual and on a macro scale, right?
Mhm.
I think that circumcision is male genital mutilation.
It is.
And I tell anybody and all of my patients and family members when they have boys, do not circumcise your child. People can certainly clean themselves. Cleanliness is not an issue. We have showers and so on and so forth. I said if we were to talk about that as a on the female side, that would be considered outrageous. This whole country was upset when they learned about all the places they do that in Africa and how gross that is. And yet, it is still standard. Now, I have patients who, fortunately can help them with fertility and they have children and so on and so forth. I'm like, they're like, well, they give all the lame reasons. It looks better. It's hard to clean. And I was like, okay, take it easy. We're smart people, okay? We can clean ourselves properly. And then what I counter that to them, I said, but the problem is that when you do that, and this is where it ties in, it reduces sensation for men in particular. They say probably up to about 30%. And I said, so I believe that this decrease in sensation is intentional from a dogmatic religious perspective in order to make sex less pleasurable, number one, to make and then number two, on the other side, it changes the way that you interact with sex because it is less pleasurable. You have to almost have more sensation to get the same amount of output, if you will. And I think it changes how men interact with sexuality just in general. And so, given that we're talking about pleasure, religion, society, and individual, I thought this fit right well here. And so I wanted to open it up because this is a hot topic I like to talk about.
It's a very important topic when I'm working with couples in sex therapy. These types of things come up as well because you cannot get a good reason for what you just talked about, like why does this have to happen? And the best they can come up with is cleanliness, which doesn't make any sense either. But and then there's the other side of it where there are many religious cultures that actually eh, female circumcision
Hmm.
from age 7 on is done so that they don't feel pleasure ever out of sex. And when I work with women who have had those kinds of incidences from childhood, which they're just one of millions, that's not, they didn't know any other women that wasn't that way. It is so difficult to see because now we're talking about not only how does it affect the person, how is it affecting the relationships they get into? It often shows up in difficulty just trusting another person and themselves in being able to lose control in a way, or some acts are okay and some acts aren't. Some people go as far as they have to go and read to see what their religion says is okay and isn't. For example, women during menstrual cycle not being able to even sleep on the same bed with, their husbands, more or less engage in anything. But people, like we said, they struggle with intimacy, especially if closeness and sexuality was heavily regarded or associated with shame, which we know it generally is for women in that way. They may second guess themselves constantly or feel like they're doing something wrong, even in a safe relationship, to just let go and be as adventurous as they want to be. And so the relational patterns of the system continues long after the system itself is not physically present anymore. I remember when I was in my master's program, and we had to do, when we were learning about couples, we had to do presentations on sex therapy presentations for some of our couples class, and the topic that I had was vaginismus, and it was so hard for me to get up and talk about that, even though I was, I don't know, 34 years old, and like, it wasn't like I was born yesterday. But I noticed that shame, that religious indoctrination in me, that as a woman, I'm standing here presenting on a sexual issue for women. That can't, what does that mean about me? And I could hear the sound, in my ear, all the shame that was. So I had to do a lot of my own work to be able to work with people, not even realizing this had affected me since I had
So
came
you
here
felt
so
like
young.
even in yourself that there was uh Dr. Sahebi, that there was this kind of like little bit of like lingering shame just about the female body overall that was sort of
Very much,
hanging around.
yes.
Mm.
So I had to sit there and I had to be present with it and be able to have discussions around it, and do a lot of what we call self of the therapist work to be able to look at ourselves and why am I not asking about the sexual relationship of couples when I'm seeing them? That's a huge part of this. Why is this not coming up? So I had to do a lot more work on learning how to work with couples and sexuality than anything else. That's even harder around emotional connection and all of that, because of the religious trauma that had impacted me without me realizing it.
Just to double back on the anger thing of this real quick, and then I want to hear about this bogues thing. You brought up this word bogues, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that one right, but so that's one of the words that you brought up. So I'm curious about both of
Me?
them. Yeah, I think you sent me something about that Persian word.
Oh, bugs, bugs.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, okay, sorry.
But
I
but
got you.
just on the anger thing, when you talk about that, that was ringing bells for me. I'm sure
I
Daniel
figured it
too.
would, Eric.
As like TCM people, you're like, ooh, this is a TCM traditional
Yeah.
Chinese medicine thing, right?
Mhm.
There's a saying in Chinese medicine that says, in adults, treat the liver, because the liver becomes associated with anger in Chinese medical thought. So I was like, ding, ding, ding. But, one of the things with that, as you're describing it, it's almost like an anger that has so many different sources that it'd
Mhm.
be hard to pin it down to something in particular. There's just so many places that has come from.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I was imagining like, all the times when you had to like swallow that anger because you couldn't react to someone who was doing something oppressive, and over and over again, like the repetition of that being so deep, as well as the kind of the other things you were talking about too. Is that how you think about, the anger in that way?
I do, but I take it one step further. So, what does it mean for trauma to become internalized? Because when we're talking about generalized anger in the way that you're talking about it, it's not something I'm noticing that I'm feeling. It's just like there's something brewing all the time. There's like a the world owes me kind of feeling, or everything is just upsetting me. So, think about it as it means the system doesn't end when you leave it, right? You're not around it, but it's still with you. We are, as you know, we're meaning making creatures. It's encoded in the brain. And where does it show up when it's encoded in the brain? The work that you do in the body. So the body is how it's expressed. So the rules, the fear, the self-monitoring, all of that becomes part of how the person thinks and feels. So even in a different environment, the same patterns continue internally. And in that sense, the system becomes psychological, not just external. And you know that, I mean, you all always teach me about trusting the body, trusting your gut feeling. What is your body will know what to do. How many times have I gotten um um
Scolded.
yes, about like tell me what are you doing, but it's about trust your body knows how to heal. So that piece of it is because there is a mechanism of internalization. That generalized anger comes out when we know that our system doesn't believe, doesn't accept what we're trying to do, what we think is the right thing to do. Because thinking, like I always tell my clients, don't trust what you're always thinking, don't believe what you think. uh Lean into it, become more curious about it. And I think that part, that generalized anger is within the body. That's how it comes out.
Well, so for this Persian word, I was trying to like
Well,
share for
oh,
those English
I love
speakers
it.
amongst us, Boghz,
Yeah.
perhaps,
Yeah.
to try to render that. And it's a very deep word, so I thought it was like something that I wanted to bring up before our pod ended today because it seems to have so many different levels of meaning, and I was curious about it.
I've written an article about this, and I have yet to find a place where, outside of Substack, where I think it's worthy of getting published. And this is and I called the article Both, the emotion behind um, Iran's cycle of resistance, but it could be anybody's cycle of resistance. So Persians have a word for the moment when emotion rises. So suddenly words fail you. Like you have no way to explain it. And that's what Boghz is. It's the throat tightening, the voice catches, tears gather, the feeling builds inside the body. There is a pressing upward, accompanying, I would say, by an uneasy awareness that you want to break free from it, something long held in place that may no longer be contained. And so anyone who has grown up in the Iranian culture specifically recognizes this feeling immediately because it appears in our poetry, in everyday conversations, and in the quiet pauses that follow very painful stories where we don't say anything after that. So both is what happens when emotions accumulate faster than it can be expressed. And when you're part of a culture where religious trauma has taken place, you have to kind of, for lack of better word, suck it up and hold your essence together, your ego together. You can't show how it's impacting you. And therefore, it's an internal experience of self where you feel it through your throat about to burst and you're about to have this experience. I allow my books to break. I'm not ashamed of it. But for so long, there was so much shame with letting somebody in front of me see the emotions that come out. And that also contributes to the aftermath of pathology of how much of that toxicity are you keeping within you, you're not allowing out. You know what I mean?
I mean, I was like looking it up, and obviously there are words that you have that have such profundity in their native language that it's hard to capture, right? but you did get, when I was looking up, there was this idea that there's the surging of emotion and maybe the repressing of the emotion in some kind of conflict or something, and the emotion wants to come out. Does that capture some of that feeling too?
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's just it's brewing, it's shaking, you're putting the lid on it, and the tighter you try to hold it together, the harder it is to hold. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's like the Rumi has a a specific line that I'll say in English. It's I carry words of your love in my heart that can never fit into speech. And I feel like that's what Bowls is, right? I just feel it. Can you feel it with me?
Mhm.
My job is to make people's books break in my sessions. And when we do, it's wonderful to see because you're just letting it all, you're letting the grief, you're letting all that structure that you're holding, fall because at the end of the day, who are we, right? We're just humans who are experiencing life. And these across generations, Iranians have always understood this kind of emotion. And as emotional as we are and relational we are, there's been this kind of, we got to keep it together. There's a pride, there's a anger, there's a longing that we cannot, that coexist, that we cannot show. I'm not very good at hiding it. I'm proud of that.
It's kind of so in the back of your mind, even when you're doing your clinical work, that word flutters a little bit, like, oh, I'm gonna like
Absolutely.
get people to
I
express.
see it. I take energy from the person and I see it in them. And you see it in their faces, the colors
Yeah.
changing. You see a younger version of self kind of come into their faces, and that's when I call it out right then and there. And I see that there's something, there's a lump I feel, there's a bugs I feel in you. What is that about? And the minute they open their mouth, everything just drops.
And it's like one of those transcending concepts because it's
Yes.
not just limited to any people. Like, this is human, just as human at its core to have this.
Yes, it
Yeah.
is.
Mm.
Some of us grow up in cultures where we are free to express emotions, and some of us who have had religious trauma, backgrounds where religion has played a role, have to hold it together more and just follow a certain path. So it is not okay to be yourself. These last few minutes, I like to put a picture of what any of these experiences can look like for a child. And I'm going to use myself as a child. I hope that's okay. So I
Mm.
can show you what, Books is that feeling of something caught in your throat. Like what could it look like? Why would it look like this? Would it be okay if I share my screen about this?
Sure. We just had to
Yeah.
describe it for those who are listening audio.
Oh, yes. I will do that. Thank you for pointing that out as well.
So if you are
So,
listening audio, try and catch the video at this point, at some point, if you're interested.
yes. So let me share my screen.
Oh, you
Oh, you
probably won't be able to share your
disabled
screen.
it. Yes,
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 I
yes.
did. And I won't be able to enable it because it takes quite some time.
Oh
Fair
no,
enough.
yeah.
Fair enough. So there are pictures that I show of how I was growing up in a culture where things were just fine. There was you could be yourself. I'm playing snow with my mom. I have a swim coach who's a guy, and I'm 5 years old, 4 years old, and I'm holding my medal, and my aunts are all around me, and uh, just everybody's dressed how they want and out picnicking, everybody's dressed how they want, and my swim team being all girls and then all male staff and coaches behind us, and this is in Iran. I wish I could show it to you. You would be very interested in seeing this. So then within a matter of weeks, things shifted into when the Ayatollah came to Iran, and like our entire culture, the way of life continued completely shifted. And then you see pictures of me going to first grade, second grade, third grade, completely covered, not just with a hijab. To this day, I have a reaction when I see hijab, even if the person is choosing to hijab. I can feel the tension inside of me still sitting in me because you have to wear something that's like a hooded part and then a covered part. And my head would itch. And when I would complain about that, then my dad would shave my head and say, well, now it won't itch anymore. Or we want to
Yikes.
go by the
Oh,
beach together. You won't be able to go play in water and sand unless they think you're a boy. So I always had to be a boy in public. So this gender identity, gender dynamic for a young girl who actually grew up, before the age of, like by the age of 4 or 5 in like a very comfortable, normal, you're a girl and that's a beautiful thing and there's no difference, to all of a sudden now you got to cover up, you got to look a certain way, and this is all that's acceptable. And even you can't even take it off during class, and it doesn't matter how much rashes you get. And it's easy for me to talk about this now, but even when I bring it up to other Iranians, because they were so used to it for so long, they don't have the same feeling as I do, because they may have had those feelings as children, but they grew used to it over time and they can't associate with how difficult this was for me. And so being able to see somebody go through these kind of shifts and changes and what it's like for a little girl, because I'm only talking about me, to be able to be put under a certain kind of veil, that is, you're not okay unless you're hidden behind certain things about you are shameful just because they are, even though you're 7, because our religion says so, was a very difficult thing to swallow. And I was not a very pleasant kid who didn't have a lot of questions. So I always had to poke the bear of like, why? I was constant. I still am that kind of person, which actually made grown-ups more angry because they didn't have answers to it. And it's always like, because this is what God likes. That was the nicest answers I would get.
it's kind of like the circumcision thing Danielle was bringing up.
Yes.
Why? Well, that's what God wants.
So
Why? Hard to
imagine
say.
if you're growing up in that, and at some point, well, maybe a lot of people aren't like me. They just accept it because they want to please, the grown-ups, or, get a good grade on the way that they're dressed, because you get graded in Iran based on how you're dressed. It's called inzabat. It's crazy. But to be able to accept it for what it is, or not accept it like me, and then live in that, and then see outside. When we moved to Sweden, before we moved here, and all the beaches there were nude. So like 2 days before we were in Iran and it was like, you're dressed like this, we go to Sweden and everybody's nude on the beaches. It's very, very difficult for an 8-year-old child, and my brother being 4, to be like, what is real in this world? Like, are they all going to hell? Like, what's happening? I'm like, so imagine this kind of dichotomy, this oscillation, and how do you work through that? Sometimes you don't. You just see it show up in different ways in your life, whether it's in your relationships. We talked about sexuality and intimacy, whether it's in your parenting style, or just the way that you exist in the world among friends and allow external events to be part of your life. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Doctor. I felt my own
Yeah.
like bogues like coming up as you were describing it, because it's one of those things you could talk about so many things, but just that experience of a girl going through that, is so symbolic of something, right? It has an overarching, I don't know, cinematic literary quality, just to see that moment of like what that would be like. Mm.
So I'll
The
tell you what,
the
I'm,
Western world
Mhm.
does not have an appreciation
Yeah.
for the subjugation of women in those cultures until they hear stories like that or they see it for themselves. And
Yes.
it's different there. And I could say, when I was in Iraq, um, I would watch these women because, much of the rest of the world, there's still multiple layers of history happening. So you'll have cars on one, so you have a 3-lane freeway, but it'll be 5 lanes of traffic with 3 lanes of cars, 1 lane of like donkey drawn carriages, and then one other lane of people walking, maybe with a cart or something else like this. We don't really have that here in most, first world westernized cultures. But in those cultures, they still do because the have-nots far outnumber the haves for sure, and it's not even close. But to see these women carrying water, carrying stuff back from the market in the middle of summer in the absolute deserts, like in Iraq, completely covered in black, carrying stuff with their kids. Like I know. I mean, I was hot and I knew that like I wasn't here forever. They live in that heat. Like that's all that they know. It's all that they have. And you look at it, and you're like, that's black in the sun
Yes.
at 2 p.m., blazing, 115 degrees. You know, that has got to be just from a humanitarian, that's insanely difficult to think about that they're going to have to live their life in that way. But we don't have an appreciation. This culture doesn't have an appreciation. The West does not, the West, and in particular, the United States, does not have appreciation for this. I feel like if we had more interactions with these kinds of stories, it would change at least some people's minds on the difficulties that much of these parts of the world have to endure, and we would have a far more compassionate stance towards them than we do now, just pointing the finger at them as like them bad. You know what I'm saying?
I remember there was absolutely. I remember there was a girl who would tell me the only thing she wishes from life is that she can ride a bicycle, illegal, by the way, for a girl to do, and feel her hair in the wind. That's it. That was her life dream. Can you imagine? Or when I was, my family wasn't religious, or if people who were religious, they were to themselves, it wasn't anything that was publicized, they prayed as they wanted to, but it wasn't about how you dress and all these external ways to kind of show who you are. So there used to be, men and women in together in weddings. And then when the Islamic Republic came, you couldn't have weddings with men and women in it. But, people would anyway. And when they would come and take people, they would take the women. And I remember this story as a kid where a bunch of my family members were taken to jail. The women were. They were taken to jail to rub off the nail polish that they had with, they gave them sugar cubes to rub it off all night. They said, by the time you are able to rub this off, then we'll let you go. So we don't sit, like you said, the Western cultures don't sit and really sit with they don't know these stories that we carry, and this is all part of, to this day, that religious trauma is with me, because when I see women under the same conditions right here, I have a reaction. And it's not because I don't respect what their belief is, but I have a very hard time believing that it is really their choice to be
Yeah.
able to have that. So thank you for letting me share that with you.
Thank you for
I
sharing.
actually send you those 2 slides of the pictures. So if you wanted to put it in the back of this when you upload, you can, for the people to see.
Thank
I
you for
think
sharing
that's
all that.
part of what you're trying to get to, Dr. Sahebi, is this idea of like there's an international quality behind this in a way, to recognize this as being like, because you've talked about this before in things where I've listened to you, you're getting to this idea of like, there has to be, even if you talk about something like feminism, there has to be an understanding this has to be international in its scope,
Yes.
right? Wherever you see this problem, it has to be called out. Our podcast is called Gin and Tantra. There's no Tantra unless you have a quality of everyone, right? It has to be like that. And, maybe that's a framing that like, can have a universalism around it, right?
But we get this wrong many times. We get lost in believing that uh, because we have to respect the differences, therefore we cannot talk about uh,
Right.
equality, and then we just hide behind it. I'm as a person who is a progressive left, I have a lot of things to criticize us regarding looking at diversity in a way that is not feminist oriented, that is looking past that, because it's inclusivity hasn't been understood as what it's supposed to be. And I think Iranians are a perfect right now in this zeitgeist being able to see this friction between the Islamic Republic and what is Islam and who are Iranians and who we're trying to show is a perfect depiction of how all of these things are interplayed and trying to just be heard about this. So thank you very much for providing a platform for me to talk about some of the experiences of what Iranians go through.
Well, thank you for sharing and for coming on and talking about all the things. We're glad to have you on and we'll be happy to have you back. Eric, as always, thank you so much for driving the boat, driving the ship. Audience, thank you so much for tuning in. As we know, this is a labor of love for us, so we appreciate everybody who comes on and sharing their stories with us. We hope that this is able to spark some conversations and light the fire of wisdom, and hope that helps to kind of open some people's eyes to things they might not have had or heard before or thought about before. So we thank you everybody for tuning in. Like, comment, subscribe, leave a comment. If you want to hit us up or you want to get a hold of Dr. Sahebi to learn more about her work or, maybe even work with her. I know her schedule's super busy, but she'll find some time for you if the stars might align.
You for more time. Oh no.
Feel free to hit us up at ginandtantra@gmail.com or leave a comment in the YouTube section. I'll be sure to check it. Or hit us up on the gram at the Gin and Tantra podcast. For Eric and Bahara, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.